A golden wheat field sways gently in the breeze. The Oklahoma sun pours over red brick rooftops. Laughter echoes from children playing tag along Greenwood Avenue. An elderly woman steps out of her neighborhood bakery, cradling a warm buttered loaf. A young man in a sharp suit boards the streetcar, clutching his morning paper. The world seems to shimmer with peace. But within a few hours, these streets will burn. Those children will cry for their parents, and America, once again, will set fire to its own promise. In 1921, in the oil-rich state of Oklahoma, Greenwood wasn't just a black neighborhood, it was a miracle. A thriving, self-sustained community built by formerly enslaved people and their descendants against all odds. There were over 300 black-owned businesses here. Banks, barbershops, hotels, cafes, libraries, movie theaters. Brick homes lined the streets, often bigger and better kept than those in white Tulsa. There were black doctors, black lawyers, black journalists, teachers, and entrepreneurs. Greenwood was the embodiment of what America promised but rarely delivered: freedom, dignity, and opportunity. So much so that the New York Times once called it the Negro Wall Street of America. And yet, for some, this success was not inspiring. It was infuriating. I remember that morning clearer than any other. The air was light. Dad was shaving. Mom had the radio on. And I just wanted to grab my ball and hit the court. Journal of Elijah Thomas, written in 1981. Elijah Thomas was not a hero. He didn't carry a rifle. He didn't fight in courtrooms. He was just a boy, tall for his age, clumsy in his step, obsessed with jazz records and peanut butter sandwiches. But he saw everything. And that makes him the perfect voice to carry us through this dark story, not with authority, but with humanity. Just south of Greenwood lay white Tulsa. And while no one would say it outright, envy and resentment festered like an untreated wound. They saw black families driving cars while some white families walked, black banks lending to black homeowners, black excellence, black joy, black prosperity, and it terrified them. Because in the Jim Crow South, power wasn't meant to wear black skin. They didn't need a reason, they just needed a spark. That afternoon, 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a young black shoe shiner, stepped into the elevator of the Drexel building. Inside stood Sarah Page, a white elevator operator. Something happened. Maybe he tripped. Maybe they knew each other. Maybe he touched her arm. Maybe nothing happened at all. But rumor traveled faster than facts in Tulsa. And by sundown, headlines blared. Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator. Lynch him tonight. Elijah remembers that his father, Dr. William Thomas, a respected black physician, came home early that day. He didn't smile. He didn't speak much. He just pulled the curtains closed. Dad never feared anyone, but that night he was silent. And when he told me not to step outside, I knew something was coming. Elijah's journal. A white mob gathered, hundreds strong, armed and seething. They wanted Rowland, dead, no trial, no questions. Southern justice, they called it. The police? They didn't disperse the crowd. They didn't lock down the jail. They simply watched. In response, a group of 75 black men arrived, many veterans of World War I, armed and ready. They had seen this before. They had watched too many hangings, and they weren't going to let it happen again. We're here to make sure he gets a trial. That's all. Justice. That's all we want. One white man tried to snatch a rifle from a black veteran's hands. A shot rang out. Back in Greenwood, Elijah sat by the window. The air had changed. The quiet felt heavy. And then he heard it. A scream, a burst of gunfire, a woman crying, somewhere far off. He turned to look outside and watched as flames began licking up the walls of Mr. Davis's butcher shop. Then a pop. Then a blast, then dozens of flames, dancing through the night like angry spirits. That was the last time I saw my neighborhood whole. Elijah. A red kite falls slowly from the sky, landing on the burning rooftop of the local schoolhouse. Inside a small brick home, Elijah clutches his little sister's hand. Their mother whispers prayers. Outside, the mob chants. Glass shatters. Sirens wail, and the night that Greenwood feared for decades had finally come. The first window shattered around 1 a.m. Elijah had barely slept. His sister clung to his side, eyes wide, silent as a ghost. Their mother paced the hallway, whispering psalms to herself. Outside, the sky no longer held the quiet blackness of night. It burned orange, twisted with smoke. Greenwood, his home, was under siege. From their small living room window, Elijah could see men carrying torches, rifles slung across their shoulders. Some wore police badges, others wore white armbands, but all of them moved with the same purpose: to destroy. A neighbor's house 3 doors down exploded into flames. A pregnant woman stumbled out with a baby in her arms, screaming. She tripped. A man caught her, dragged her toward safety, only to fall to the ground moments later, blood spraying from his back. Elijah couldn't see the shooter, only the shadows moving, fast, merciless. His father burst into the room, carrying a black doctor's bag and 2 small revolvers. He handed one to Elijah's mother. "I need to get to the clinic," he said. "No," she whispered, "you won't make it." "I have to try." The front door creaked open. Elijah could hear the crackling of wood, the moans of the dying, the thundering of boots. His father paused at the threshold, turned back, looked straight at him. "Whatever happens," he said, "you stay alive. Do you understand?" Elijah nodded, too stunned to speak. Then his father was gone. They wouldn't see him again for 3 days. The streets of Greenwood became a battlefield. Black men, many of them war veterans, defended their homes with everything they had: old rifles, hunting shotguns, even pistols from the Spanish-American War. For a few hours, they held back the tide, but the attackers came in waves, organized, fueled by rage, and, in some cases, assisted by law enforcement. The Thomas family tried to flee around 3 a.m. Elijah's mother grabbed their emergency bag, wrapped her daughter in a wool blanket, and pulled Elijah by the arm. They slipped through the alley behind their home, ducking under fences, clinging to the shadows. They passed Mrs. Henderson's cafe, once the pride of the avenue, now gutted by fire. The walls still stood, barely, but the smell of gasoline and scorched flesh lingered in the air. A man crawled out from the smoke, coughing. His leg was gone below the knee. Elijah stared at him too long. His mother forced him to look away. At the edge of the commercial district, near the Dreamland Theater, they encountered a group of other families, dozens of them, huddled beneath an overturned fruit cart. Some were praying, some were bleeding. One woman cradled a lifeless child, rocking back and forth, humming a lullaby. That's when they heard it, overhead, a low, droning hum. Elijah looked up. It was a plane. Then another. Then a third. Too small to be military. These were private aircraft, single-engine biplanes. At first he thought they were there to help, to observe. But then something dropped from the sky. A thud. Then fire. Then another. And another. Homemade firebombs. Kerosene-filled bottles. Burning rags. Tossed like candy from the clouds. The air became unbearable, thick with soot, with ash, with panic. The planes circled like vultures, raining hell on a city that had no defense. It was the first time American citizens were bombed by aircraft on U.S. soil, and no one came to stop it. Elijah and his family ran, toward the river, toward darkness, anywhere. At one point, they passed the Mount Zion Baptist Church, its proud white steeple glowing in the firelight. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a symbol of strength. But that night, it was marked for destruction. White men had piled dynamite at its base. Hours later, it would be reduced to rubble. As dawn approached, the world turned gray, not because the sun wasn't rising, but because the smoke was too thick to let light through. Elijah's shoes were torn, his legs bled from broken glass. His little sister wheezed beside him, barely conscious. Still, they ran. By 6 a.m., thousands of black residents had been rounded up, herded into makeshift internment camps, fairgrounds, baseball fields, and public halls. Anyone who resisted was beaten or shot. Anyone who spoke back was silenced. Elijah and his family managed to reach the edge of the Arkansas River, hiding under a bridge with nearly 50 others. The water beneath them ran slow and black. They didn't dare make a sound. Some children whimpered, mothers hushed them. One man tried to swim across and disappeared into the current. From under the bridge, Elijah saw Greenwood die, Block by block, brick by brick, he saw men laugh as they looted the homes he'd grown up in. He saw churches set ablaze, libraries turn to ash, piano keys melting in the street. He felt something inside him twist and snap. This wasn't war. This wasn't justice. This was erasure. By 8 a.m., the Oklahoma National Guard finally arrived, but not to protect the black residents. Instead, they assisted in securing the area, which meant disarming black defenders, enforcing curfews, and continuing the roundups. Elijah's mother was separated from them at the checkpoint. A white officer grabbed her by the arm, shoved her into a cattle truck with other women. Elijah screamed. A soldier raised his rifle. "Move, boy," he growled. "I'm not leaving my mother," Elijah shouted. The man lowered the barrel to Elijah's chest, but another soldier, older, grayer, intervened. "Let him go with her," he said quietly. The first soldier cursed but relented. Later, Elijah would remember that man's face, not because he was kind, but because he was the only white face that didn't carry hatred that day. The truck rumbled down the road, passing piles of rubble that had once been schools, barber shops, family homes. Elijah looked back, eyes burning, throat raw. Greenwood was gone, all of it. By the end of June 1st, more than 1,200 homes had been destroyed. Hundreds were dead, some estimates suggest 300 or more. Over 10,000 people were left homeless. And Dick Rowland, the young man whose arrest had sparked it all? He was quietly released, no charges filed, no apology, no justice. As the sun finally broke through the smoke-choked sky, Elijah sat beside his sister and mother in the holding field. His clothes were wet with sweat and soot, his hands trembled. He was only 16, but he had just watched America burn its own. And no one came. No one came. The sun rose on June 2nd, but no one in Greenwood looked up to greet it. The sky was a dull gray, smeared with the remnants of ash. The wind still carried the acrid scent of burned wood, scorched flesh, and dreams reduced to cinders. Elijah sat in the holding field with hundreds of others, silent. No one spoke, no one cried anymore. Exhaustion had dried up every tear. His little sister slept against his chest, her face smudged black with soot. His mother stared into the distance, unmoving. Her hands, once so gentle, were clenched into fists. Across the fence, white volunteers walked by with bowls of water, sandwiches, blankets, but their eyes never met the eyes of the people inside. They passed out kindness like penance, small, controlled, and impersonal. Later that morning, a truck arrived with a priest and 2 white nurses. They began treating the wounded, checking for infection, giving tetanus shots. One nurse cleaned the gash on Elijah's arm.
"She didn't ask his name. You're lucky," she said flatly. "Some didn't make it out at all." Elijah didn't answer. What do you say when luck means you survived a massacre? Officials from the city council came around noon, not to apologize, not to offer help, but to register the displaced. Name, age, occupation, property value. A man with a clipboard looked Elijah's mother up and down and asked, "Do you have proof of ownership for your home?" She blinked, confused. "Our house is gone." "Well, without documents, we can't verify losses. You'll need to reapply if you want to rebuild." Reapply, as if their lives had been a paperwork error. As if the fire that devoured their street hadn't also swallowed every birth certificate, deed, and ledger. Later that day, white photographers arrived. They walked freely through the wreckage, snapping images of burned bodies, crumbled churches, collapsed rooftops. One man smiled as he held up a charred Bible for the camera. Another posed beside the skeletal remains of a Model T. They weren't here to mourn. They were collecting trophies. Elijah watched from behind a wire fence. Rage simmered in his chest, but he was too tired to scream. By the second evening, temporary camps had been set up across the city. Black families were herded into fairgrounds and schoolyards, assigned numbers, and kept under curfew. Anyone found wandering after dark was arrested. Elijah's family ended up in a livestock building at the Tulsa State Fairgrounds. Rows of cots lined the concrete floor. The air smelled of hay, sweat, and despair. Volunteers from white churches arrived with boxes of old clothes. Elijah was given a pair of trousers 2 sizes too big and a shirt that still smelled of cigar smoke. His sister cried when a stranger tried to cut her hair. His mother refused to accept the shoes they offered. She sat barefoot, arms crossed, eyes burning. By the third day, rumors began to spread. They say it was our fault. They're blaming the colored folks for defending themselves. They called it a riot. A riot, not a massacre, not an act of terror, not an annihilation, but a riot. As if the people of Greenwood had set fire to their own homes, as if the blood on the streets had spilled from mutual combat. The newspapers followed suit. Headlines across the country read, "Tulsa Negro Uprising Leaves City in Flames." "Race Riot in Oklahoma. Armed Negroes Clash with Police." None of them told the truth. None mentioned the bombs, the planes, the vigilante mobs. None spoke of the silence from the state government, the complicity of law enforcement, or the cheering crowds that watched Greenwood burn. Elijah read the papers with trembling hands. He felt like he was watching his reality being rewritten in real time. Every lie printed became another brick in the wall between what happened and what America would choose to remember.
The first time Elijah returned to Greenwood was on June 5th. He went with his mother and a small group of men to see if anything could be salvaged. There was nothing. His home was a hollowed-out shell. The front porch had collapsed. The kitchen was blackened with soot. His father's clinic, once filled with laughter, books, and clean white coats, was now a smoking pit. Elijah stood where his bed used to be and picked up a piece of wood still warm from the fire. On it was a burned corner of his favorite poster, Jack Johnson, the black heavyweight champion, mid-swing. His hero, his hope. He folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. His mother didn't cry. She didn't curse. She simply knelt in the dirt and began digging with her bare hands. Elijah wanted to stop her, to say there was nothing left, but he couldn't. He sat beside her and dug too. That night, they slept under a borrowed tent. Volunteers came the next morning. White city engineers, government agents, insurance adjusters. "Most of the policies won't pay out," one man explained. "Riot clause. If damage is caused by civil unrest, it's not covered." A woman nearby dropped to her knees. "But we didn't riot," she sobbed. "They did this to us." The man didn't respond. Over 1,400 insurance claims were filed by black residents after the massacre. Not one was paid. In the weeks that followed, some local leaders suggested relocating Greenwood entirely. Others proposed building a train depot over the ruins. They called it redevelopment. They said it would be good for business. But the people of Greenwood refused to vanish. Elijah's family, like many others, began rebuilding with whatever they had: scraps of lumber, borrowed nails, donated tarps. Women cooked on open fires. Children carried buckets from nearby wells. Men hammered day and night, using pieces of churches to rebuild homes, pieces of schools to rebuild stores. It was slow, it was painful, but it was survival. And still, no one was arrested. No white mob leaders were named. No police officers were fired. No city officials stepped down. Not one person faced a single charge for what had happened. The silence was suffocating. At church services, pastors called for forgiveness. Politicians spoke of moving forward. But Elijah couldn't forget. Neither could his mother. The world had changed. Greenwood was no longer a place. It was a wound. One evening, as Elijah sat by a fire near what used to be his school, an old man beside him said, "They want us to rebuild and be quiet, but if we're quiet, they'll bury us twice." Elijah nodded. He was only 16, but he understood that survival wasn't enough. Someone would have to remember. Someone would have to tell the truth. Elijah's father returned on the 6th day. They found him at the edge of what used to be Greenwood's hospital, collapsed from exhaustion. His coat was gone.
His hands were black with soot and dried blood. He had been treating survivors non-stop, moving from house to house, hiding in basements, operating by candlelight. When Elijah saw him, he ran. No words, just the kind of embrace only grief and survival can create. His father said little that first night. He sat by the fire, legs shaking, hands trembling, and stared into the smoke. Elijah's mother pressed a warm cloth to his face, whispering things only he could hear. His sister, too young to understand, just curled beside him like she used to. The next morning, he spoke. "I saw what they did," he said. "I saw people shot in front of churches. I saw bodies stacked behind stores like firewood." He looked up.
no one will believe us." And that, more than anything, terrified Elijah. The world outside Greenwood moved on. Trains still ran, stores still opened, people still whistled down the streets of white Tulsa. But in Greenwood, time had frozen. The ruins remained, like charred bones. Yet no officials came with investigations. No memorials were planned. The city's newspapers shifted topics within days. For them, the riot had ended. For Greenwood, the silence had just begun. On June 10th, a community meeting was held in the remnants of Vernon AME Church. The roof was gone, the pews were scorched, but the people came anyway, hundreds of them, standing shoulder to shoulder. "We cannot let this be forgotten," the preacher said. "We cannot let them tell the story their way." A few elders proposed writing everything down: names, dates, witness accounts. Elijah's father raised his hand. "We need records, we need affidavits, we need photographs." Someone else spoke up. "We need the white press." That drew a bitter laugh from the room. But they were right. If they didn't document it, someone else would, and that someone might turn truth into myth. Over the following weeks, a small group of volunteers began compiling evidence. They interviewed survivors, collected burnt property deeds, copied down burial records from memory. One young woman, a school teacher, began drawing maps, hand-sketched layouts of Greenwood as it was, labeling every home, every business, every tree. Elijah helped. He walked through the rubble with a notebook, sketching buildings as they once stood. He interviewed shopkeepers who'd lost everything. He recorded what they said, word for word. It became his purpose, a way to fight back without lifting a weapon. But not everyone was supportive. One afternoon, Elijah approached a white city clerk to request a copy of Greenwood's original zoning plans. The man looked at him, then slowly shook his head. "You people brought this on yourselves," he said. "You poked the hive too long. What did you expect would happen?" Elijah didn't answer. He didn't have to. He knew now that the wound wouldn't just be ignored, it would be denied. Weeks turned into months. The camps disbanded. Most families returned to whatever scraps they could reclaim. Some left Tulsa entirely, vowing never to speak of what happened again. Others stayed, rebuilding brick by brick. But beneath the ash, a new kind of fire smoldered, quiet, focused, determined. One morning, a federal investigator arrived. His name was Agent Wheeler. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, suit too neat for the Oklahoma summer. He asked to speak with Elijah's father, who by then had reopened a tiny clinic inside what used to be a corner barbershop. "I'm here unofficially," Wheeler said. "Washington wants to know what happened." The doctor laughed. "You're 5 weeks too late." Still, they talked. Wheeler listened, took notes. He asked Elijah to recount what he saw. Elijah told him about the planes, the bombs, the police who stood by and watched. Wheeler said nothing for a long time. Then he folded his notepad and stood. "You won't hear from me again," he said, "but I'll do what I can." He never returned. Rumors swirled that Wheeler had been reassigned. Others said he was threatened. One night, Elijah found a note nailed to the door of their temporary clinic. It read, "Stop stirring ghosts, or you'll become one." Fear returned. Not the fear of fire or bullets, but of erasure. The kind of terror that seeps into your bones when you realize not just your home, but your history is being stolen. At school, what was left of it, Elijah heard white teachers tell a different story. It was unfortunate, they'd say, but the Negroes got too bold. When Elijah objected, they told him to leave the room. "You weren't there," he whispered. "I read the papers," the teacher snapped. In August, a prominent newspaper in New York published a brief article. "Negro uprising in Tulsa causes heavy property losses." One paragraph, 50 words, no names, no humanity. Elijah tore it out and folded it into his notebook. That fall, Greenwood began rebuilding in earnest. Families pooled resources, churches hosted community meals, young men laid bricks during the day and studied by kerosene lamp at night. Elijah helped build 3 homes that season, including his own. But something had shifted in him. He didn't laugh like he used to. He didn't dream about college anymore. His drawings became darker, rooftops aflame, faces twisted in pain, buildings falling into themselves. One evening, his father found him alone on the edge of town, sketching in silence.
Still remembering? He asked. No, Elijah said, still proving it happened. His father sat beside him. You shouldn't have to, he said softly, but I'm proud you are. They sat that way for a long time. By winter, Greenwood's population had begun to stabilize. New businesses opened, babies were born, weddings were held. Life, stubborn as ever, insisted on moving forward. But for those who lived through the fire, nothing would ever be the same. There were no reparations, no trials, no federal aid, just silence and stories. Stories whispered between pews, murmured over dinner tables. Passed from one trembling hand to another like heirlooms too painful to display. Elijah kept writing. He filled notebooks, sketchbooks, binders. He kept them hidden beneath floorboards and under mattresses. He understood now. Memory could be stolen too. And when people said, "Let it go," he replied, "If I do, who will remember?" He was only 16, but he had become the memory keeper, and in a world that refused to admit the fire ever happened, that made him dangerous. By the end of 1921, winter had settled over Tulsa. The wind carried a chill that slipped through the gaps in makeshift walls and cracked glass. Families huddled close inside half-built homes, wrapped in coats that did not belong to them. Fires burned low in salvaged stoves, fed by pieces of old furniture and broken fence posts. Greenwood was rebuilding, slowly, quietly, stubbornly. But even as walls rose and roads were cleared, something within the people remained shattered. Elijah noticed it first in the way people avoided each other's eyes, in the long silences during conversations, in the way laughter now came out dry and brittle, like dead leaves being crushed underfoot. At church, hymns were sung softly, as if joy had become too loud, too dangerous. At school, the number of students had dropped. Some families had left Oklahoma entirely, their names never mentioned again. Others had buried their children and carried on as if survival itself was proof of worth. Elijah returned to class in January. The school had no roof, the chalkboards were scorched. The only heat came from a small iron stove in the back. But the teacher, Miss Randolph, stood every morning in a patched gray coat, teaching with the same fire she had before the massacre. "History is written by the ones who choose to speak," she said one morning, her voice hoarse. "That is why we must not be silent." Elijah took her words to heart. He continued sketching, journaling, recording. He became obsessed with detail. The exact number of bricks it took to rebuild Mr. Owens's bakery. The names of the nurses who refused to treat black patients after the fire. The scent of the air on the morning he saw his father collapse from exhaustion. But no matter how much he wrote, the memories did not fade. If anything, they became heavier. At night, Elijah had dreams he could not control. He saw planes overhead, dropping fire onto his sister's bed. He saw himself running down Greenwood Avenue, but the road never ended. He would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. His mother noticed. One morning, as she stirred oatmeal over the stove, she said softly, "You are not broken, Elijah. You are just carrying too much." He wanted to believe her, but the burden was everywhere. When he walked through the city, white residents still smiled politely. They still tipped their hats. But Elijah saw what was behind their eyes. Pity, suspicion, indifference.
Not one of them said, "I am sorry." Not one said, "We were wrong." They simply acted as if nothing had happened, as if Greenwood had been a bad dream from which they had already awakened. One afternoon, Elijah visited the public library to look up records of the massacre. There were none. He asked the clerk, a thin man with glasses and a mustache too large for his face. "We do not carry that kind of material here," the man said. There was unrest, yes, but nothing worth preserving. Elijah felt his hands tremble, not from fear, but from a growing realization. They were erasing him, erasing all of them. At home, he told his father. His father listened, then opened a drawer in his desk. He pulled out a small wooden box and handed it to Elijah. Inside were photographs. Not many, maybe 20. Burnt corners, blurred faces. But they were real. They were proof. "These are yours now," his father said. "Keep them safe. One day, someone will ask." Elijah nodded, but deep inside, he doubted anyone ever would. In the spring of 1922, Greenwood celebrated the opening of a new community center.
It was built entirely by volunteers, brick by brick, beam by beam. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was modest. No politicians attended, no media covered it. But the people came. They brought pots of stew, loaves of bread, jars of honey. Children played in the dirt while elders shared stories. There was music again, real music. Jazz played on a cracked phonograph, accompanied by the sound of clapping hands and stomping feet. For a few hours, Greenwood felt whole. But as the sun set, a heavy rain began to fall. And as people ran for cover, Elijah stood in the middle of the square, letting the rain soak through his clothes. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "We are still here." That summer, Elijah began volunteering at a new community newspaper, the Greenwood Voice. It was small, 4 pages, printed weekly, but it was honest. It published names, dates, eyewitness accounts. Elijah's first article was a personal piece titled, "I Remember the Fire." It described the night of May 31 in detail, the smells, the sounds, the faces. He wrote it not for revenge, but for remembrance. When it was published, several people approached him. "You put into words what I could not say," one woman told him, eyes wet. But others were not as kind. One afternoon, Elijah found a note on his doorstep. "You are lucky to be alive. Stop talking." He kept the note. He added it to his collection. Because even threats, when recorded, become evidence. Meanwhile, the city of Tulsa moved on. New businesses opened, new roads were built, property values rose, white neighborhoods expanded. Greenwood was allowed to exist, but not to thrive. Banks refused to offer loans to black residents. Insurance companies continued to deny claims.
The city council passed zoning laws that made rebuilding more expensive, more complicated. It was slow suffocation, legal, polite, deadly. One day, Elijah accompanied his father to a medical conference in Oklahoma City. At the entrance, a white doctor looked at them and asked, "Are you here to clean up?" His father stared at him for a moment, then replied, "No, I am here to remind you what you failed to protect." They were not allowed inside. Back home, Elijah asked his father why he had not fought harder. His father looked tired. "I have fought every day since I was born," he said, "but I am starting to realize they are not listening." Elijah disagreed. "They may not listen now," he said, "but one day someone will." He believed that. He had to, because if he did not, then everything they had survived meant nothing. So he kept writing. He documented every rebuilt home, every reopened shop, every funeral held for someone whose body was never recovered. He wrote about joy, too, about weddings, about new babies, about the way his mother smiled again when his sister learned to read. Because memory was not just pain, it was everything. It was the only weapon they had left. By the end of 1922, Elijah had filled 7 notebooks. He kept them in a wooden box beneath his bed, wrapped in cloth, protected from fire and flood. And every night, before he slept, he would open the box, choose a page, and read. To remember, to honor, to resist. Because Greenwood had burned, but Elijah had not, and as long as he breathed, the truth would not be silent. In the early months of 1923, Greenwood stood like a scar that refused to fade. New buildings lined the streets, shops reopened, children returned to school. But beneath every brick was the memory of ash. Beneath every smile lingered a shadow. The rest of America had already moved on. In Washington, there were no speeches, no official acknowledgement, no investigations. The massacre had not made national headlines for more than a day. It had not prompted emergency funding. It had not inspired legislative reform. For the federal government, Tulsa was a local matter, a flare-up, an unfortunate incident. But for the people of Greenwood, it had been the apocalypse. Elijah continued to write. Every evening, after work and school, he would sit by the window of their small rebuilt home and fill page after page with testimony. He had started interviewing elderly residents, asking them to recall their lives before the fire, the businesses they lost, the names of neighbors who never returned.
He became the unofficial archivist of a forgotten war. One afternoon, while organizing his notes, Elijah found an old flyer tucked between 2 pages. It was an advertisement for the Tulsa Colored Business Fair, dated May 1921. The event had been planned for the week after the massacre. It never happened.
Most of the businesses listed on the flyer no longer existed. Elijah pinned it to the wall above his desk, a reminder of what had been and what had been taken. That spring, a historian from Chicago arrived in Tulsa. His name was Walter Hall. He had read a short blurb in a regional black newspaper and had come to see for himself what had happened. Elijah met him through Miss Randolph, his former teacher. Walter was tall, sharp-eyed, and relentless. He carried a leather-bound notebook and a camera. He asked questions that made people uncomfortable. He refused to accept vague answers. "History is not memory," he told Elijah. "History is evidence." For 2 weeks, Walter interviewed dozens of survivors. He walked every street. He photographed every ruin. When he left, he promised to publish what he found. "Do not count on your country to tell this story," he said before boarding the train. "You must tell it yourselves, again and again." Elijah never forgot those words. But publishing was not easy. The Greenwood Voice had limited circulation. Larger newspapers refused to reprint their stories. When Elijah submitted an op-ed to a local paper about the use of airplanes during the massacre, the editor responded, "There is no proof such things happened." No proof. As if the smoke still rising from the ground had been imagined. As if the scars on Elijah's hands were fiction. He began compiling a personal archive, a library of truth. His notebooks, clippings, affidavits, maps. He stored them in a metal trunk hidden in the basement of the new church. "Why here?" his mother asked. "Because no one will think to burn the same church twice," he said. Outside Greenwood, the world changed. The 1920s roared on. Jazz spread across the country. Skyscrapers rose in New York. The stock market climbed. White America celebrated its progress. But for Black Americans, the pain persisted. Jim Crow laws tightened their grip. Lynchings continued. Segregation expanded. And no one spoke of Tulsa. It was not taught in schools. It was not discussed in government. Children grew up in Oklahoma without ever hearing the word Greenwood. Elijah saw it happen in real time. By 1925, new residents had moved into Tulsa. White families who had never seen the fire. They looked at Greenwood with confusion. "I thought this was a poor area," one man said. "It was," his friend replied. "Then they burned it and blamed the people who lived here." But even that truth was fading. At a community meeting, Elijah stood to speak. "We are being buried under silence," he said. "If we do not keep telling the truth, we will vanish again." Some nodded, others looked away. It was exhausting to remember. Some people wanted to forget. Others needed to. But Elijah could not. In 1926, he began work on a book. He titled it "The Fire in the Land." It was part memoir, part history, part warning. He wrote every morning before work, every night after dinner. He poured everything he knew onto the pages. When it was finished, he sent it to publishers. None accepted it. "This subject is too inflammatory," one editor wrote. Another said, "There is no market for stories about race violence." Elijah stored the manuscript in the same trunk with his other records. He told himself that one day someone would want it. He had to believe that. One day, while walking near the river, Elijah saw a group of white children playing. They laughed and ran and shouted. One of them pointed toward Greenwood and asked, "What is that place?" The other child shrugged. "I don't know, just some old black neighborhood." Elijah stopped walking. That moment haunted him for weeks. Not because the child was cruel, but because the child was honest. Because in just a few years, the truth had vanished so completely that even the children no longer saw the ashes. Elijah returned home and opened the trunk. He read his manuscript again. It still hurt, but he read it anyway, because the story had not changed, only the world around it had. In 1927, Elijah received a letter from Walter Hall. The historian had managed to publish a small pamphlet through a university press. It was titled The Greenwood Catastrophe. Only 500 copies were printed, but it existed. Elijah held the booklet in his hands and wept. It was not enough, but it was something. Later that year, Elijah gave a talk at a church gathering. He stood in front of 50 people, young and old, and told them the truth, in detail, without fear. Afterward, a woman approached him. "My son never believed it happened," she said. "Now he does." That was the moment Elijah knew he would never stop. He would tell the story until his voice failed, until someone listened, until the fire in the land became more than just smoke on the wind. By the time Elijah turned 25, Greenwood had changed beyond recognition. There were new businesses, new houses, new families. Children ran through the streets again. Jazz spilled from open windows. People smiled in public. They shook hands. They said, "We are moving forward." But Elijah knew better. The pain had not disappeared. It had only gone quiet. It lived in the silences between sentences, in the way elders paused before answering questions, in the flicker in a mother's eyes when someone asked about her son who never came home. The trauma had not ended. It had simply learned to dress itself in Sunday clothes. Elijah had become a teacher. He taught literature and history at a small school just 5 blocks from where his childhood home once stood. He walked to work every day past rebuilt storefronts and new churches, his leather satchel filled with lesson plans and blank notebooks. He was good at it. His students listened. They respected him.
But when he tried to teach them about Greenwood, about what had happened, he faced resistance from parents, from other teachers, from the school board. "There is no curriculum for that," they said. "It might confuse the children," others added. And worst of all, that was a long time ago. Elijah did not argue. He simply brought his own books, his own records, his own truth. He told the story as he had lived it. Some students listened. Others stared blankly. A few laughed nervously. One day, a boy raised his hand and asked, "If this really happened, why is it not in any textbook?" Elijah looked at him and replied, "Because people do not erase what never happened. They erase what they are afraid to remember." He continued teaching. Outside the classroom, Elijah still wrote. He still maintained his archive. He still added clippings, notes, maps, photographs. He still believed that someday someone would care. But as the years passed, hope became heavier. His peers were tired. Some had grown bitter. Others had chosen silence, believing that speaking out only brought pain. One evening, Elijah attended a neighborhood gathering. The mood was light. Music played. Children danced. Someone passed him a plate of fried catfish and asked how school was going. He smiled and said, "Good." No one mentioned the past. No one asked about the fire, the camps, the dead. As if a line had been drawn between now and then. As if survival had a price, and that price was silence. Later that night, Elijah walked home alone. He passed the old church, now fully rebuilt, painted white, glowing in the moonlight. He remembered hiding there, the smoke, the screams, the trembling hands. He sat on the steps and watched the empty street. "Maybe I am the only one left who cannot forget," he said to himself. But he was wrong. In the years that followed, a new generation began to ask questions. Teenagers whispered about family secrets. College students dug through forgotten archives. Young activists knocked on doors, seeking stories. They came to Elijah, one by one. They sat in his living room. They listened to his voice. They took notes, recorded interviews, asked questions he never thought anyone would ask again. And for the first time in decades, Elijah felt something stir inside him. Not hope, but possibility. One student, a young woman named Vanessa, visited every Saturday for months. She was writing her thesis on racial violence in the Midwest. She read every page of Elijah's notes. She asked about everything: names, dates, streets, smells. She cried once. "I had no idea," she said. Elijah nodded. "Most people do not," he replied. Vanessa promised to keep going, to share the story, to challenge the silence. When she left for graduate school, she gave Elijah a gift, a leather-bound book. Inside were typed transcripts of his journal entries, organized by date.
A title printed on the first page read, "Testimony of Fire." Elijah ran his hand over the cover. He said nothing, but tears welled in his eyes. Still, the world outside moved slowly. In 1935, Elijah attended a town meeting where a proposal was made to pave over part of Greenwood for a new highway. The speaker called the area underdeveloped. Elijah stood. "This land is not empty," he said. "It is sacred. It holds the bones of our story." They ignored him. Construction began the following spring. A concrete line split Greenwood in half. Years later, another shopping center replaced the block where Elijah had once lived. There was no plaque, no marker, no sign, just asphalt and advertisements. Elijah visited the site one evening. He stood beside a clothing store and looked out at what used to be his home. A young man walked by and asked if he needed help. Elijah shook his head. "No," he said, "I am just remembering." The young man smiled politely and walked away. He did not ask what Elijah was remembering. He did not know. And that, more than anything, hurt the most. Because Greenwood was not just a place. It was a memory fighting to stay alive in a country trying to forget. Elijah was now in his 40s. His hair had begun to gray. His hands ached in the winter. His voice was softer. But his resolve had not changed. He kept teaching, he kept writing, he kept telling the story. Because the past was not finished. It lived in the present, and until the world was ready to face it, Elijah would carry it, not because he wanted to, but because someone had to. In the spring of 1941, Elijah Thomas turned 40 years old. His hair had grayed at the temples. His back ached when he stood too long. His eyesight had begun to fade slightly, but his memory remained sharp, sharp enough to wound, sharp enough to cut through time. He still taught, still wrote, still walked the streets of Greenwood every morning before sunrise, as if greeting ghosts. The world around him was changing fast. President Roosevelt had just signed the Lend-Lease Act. War in Europe loomed large over every newspaper headline. Radios buzzed with voices from London, Berlin, Tokyo. People spoke of Hitler, Churchill, Mussolini. No one spoke of Tulsa. Not in the newspapers, not in the schools, not in the churches, not even in Greenwood anymore. Silence had become an institution. But Elijah refused to forget. That spring, he made a decision. He would publish the story. Not a pamphlet, not an article, a book, a complete, undeniable account. He called it The Ashes That Speak. He spent every night typing on a second-hand typewriter, using carbon paper to make copies. The keys stuck, the ribbon was faded, but he pressed on. Chapter by chapter, he poured his life onto the page. He wrote of the morning of May 31, the elevator incident, the gathering mob.
The first shots fired. He described the flames, the bombs from above, the bodies on the street. He named the dead. He named the buildings. He named the silence. By August, the manuscript was complete. 300 pages, neatly typed, double-spaced, stored in a cloth binder. Elijah saved enough money to take a train to Chicago, where he planned to meet with small publishers who specialized in historical nonfiction. He wore his best suit, the one he had worn to his sister's wedding. He carried the manuscript wrapped in oilcloth, tucked under one arm like a newborn child. The train ride took 13 hours. During the journey, Elijah stared out the window, watching the landscape roll past. He thought of his students. He thought of his father, now buried under a headstone that read only, "He served." He thought of the sound the first plane made as it descended over Greenwood. He arrived in Chicago just after midnight. He rented a room in a boarding house near the publishing district. It was small and smelled of old paper and coal dust. He did not mind. He was not there for comfort. Over the next 5 days, Elijah visited 6 publishing houses. At each one he was polite, he smiled, he answered every question. And at each one he was told the same thing: "We are not interested. This story will not sell. No one wants to read about that." One editor, a middle-aged white man with gold-rimmed glasses, flipped through a few pages and said, "This seems rather one-sided." Elijah leaned forward. "It is one-sided because only one side dropped bombs, only one side burned churches, only one side killed children." The editor handed the pages back. "People are looking for hope right now," he said, "not guilt." By the end of the week, Elijah had exhausted every contact. He stood at the edge of Lake Michigan, watching the water churn beneath the cloudy sky, manuscript in hand. He considered throwing it in, letting the waves carry it away like so many stories before. But he did not. He returned to Tulsa with the pages still intact. When he walked into his house, his mother, now nearly 70, her hair fully white, stood in the kitchen. She saw his face, and she knew. "They were not ready," she said. "No," Elijah replied, "but I was." That fall, America entered the war. After Pearl Harbor, all attention turned overseas. Young men enlisted, factories changed production, the nation unified under flags and fear. In Greenwood, families prayed for sons already drafted. Elijah taught wartime literature in his classroom. He read aloud Wilfred Owen and Langston Hughes. He spoke of sacrifice, of courage, of truth. But he did not speak of Greenwood, not during those years. It was too far removed from the American narrative, too dangerous to say aloud. Still, he kept the manuscript on his bookshelf beside the Bible and his father's medical textbooks.
He continued updating it, adding details, correcting names, refining dates. He began calling it Volume 1, unsure if there would ever be another. In 1944, a young soldier returned home to Greenwood after fighting in Italy. He had medals on his chest and a limp in his step. Elijah met him at the train station. The soldier saluted him. "I have heard about you," he said. "My grandmother said you remember what they want to forget." Elijah nodded. "I remember," he said. The soldier paused. "I fought Nazis, sir," he said. "But sometimes I wonder if I came home to something worse." That night, Elijah reopened the manuscript. He wrote a new chapter. It was titled The War They Never Fought. In it, he described how memory could be more fragile than flesh, how a nation could erase the truth not with bullets, but with indifference. By 1947, Elijah was 46 years old. He had not given up, but he had stopped hoping. Until one day, a letter arrived. It was from a small black-owned press in Kansas City. The editor, a man named Harold Fisher, had received a copy of the manuscript from a mutual friend. He wanted to publish it. He believed in it. Elijah did not cry, but when he placed the letter on the table, his hand shook. 2 months later, a box arrived. Inside were 50 copies of The Ashes That Speak. The cover was simple, black letters on a white background, no photographs, no endorsements, but it was real. Elijah held the first copy for a long time. He ran his fingers across the spine. He opened it to the first page and read aloud the dedication. To the children who ran, to the mothers who burned, to the men who were never buried. This is for you. He delivered copies to churches, schools, libraries. Most accepted them politely, a few did not. But the book existed, and that was enough for now. That winter, Elijah gave a public reading. Only 20 people attended. But when he finished, they stood, not in applause, but in silence, the kind of silence that holds reverence, the kind that does not forget. And for the first time in 20 years, Elijah Thomas felt heard. By 1952, Elijah Thomas was 57 years old. His hair was almost entirely silver now. His steps were slower, more deliberate. His hands, once steady with pen and pencil, had begun to tremble slightly with age. But his voice still held the same weight it always had. People had started calling him professor, even though he had never received a university degree. It was not a title of academia, but of respect. In Greenwood, everyone knew that if you wanted to understand what had happened, what had really happened, you went to Elijah. The Ashes That Speak had sold modestly. It never reached national circulation. Most bookstores refused to carry it. Mainstream publications ignored it. No major reviews were written. But in small churches, in kitchen tables across Oklahoma, in community libraries and dusty living rooms, it was read. It passed from hand to hand like a secret inheritance. By then, Elijah had begun working on a second volume. He titled it The Silence That Followed. This one was not about the fire. It was about everything that came after. The cover-ups, the zoning laws, the erasure, the cost of rebuilding without support, the price of surviving in a country that refused to see what it had done. He wrote about how trauma settles into a place, how it becomes the air people breathe, how silence is not peace, but pressure. He interviewed men who had lost brothers but never cried, women who never remarried because they could not trust again, children who had grown into adults believing they were cursed. The stories filled pages, dozens of them, and with each page, Elijah felt the weight of his mission more deeply. He was no longer writing just to preserve the past. He was writing to keep it from happening again. But outside Greenwood, little had changed. Television was becoming the new national storyteller, and television had no interest in Greenwood. The images broadcast to the nation showed smiling white families in new suburbs, new cars, new jobs. The American dream perfected, packaged, sold. There was no space in that dream for the people who had watched their own neighbors be burned alive. Elijah tried reaching out again. He wrote letters to journalists. He sent copies of his book to television producers, to college professors, to senators. Most never replied. The few who did responded with polite detachment. Thank you for your submission. Unfortunately, our current programming is focused on post-war optimism and economic progress. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of desegregation in the landmark Brown v. Board of Education case. The news shook the country. Elijah stood before his class that day and held up a newspaper. "This is progress," he said, "but do not mistake it for justice." One student raised her hand. "Will they ever apologize?" she asked. Elijah paused. "I do not know," he said, "but apology without acknowledgement is nothing more than noise." Later that year, Elijah was invited to speak at a small, historically black college in Texas. He packed a bag, took the train, and delivered a lecture titled "History Beneath Our Feet." He spoke for 90 minutes. The audience sat in silence the entire time. Afterward, a young man approached him. "My grandfather died in Tulsa," he said. "You just gave him a voice." That moment stayed with Elijah for months, because in it he saw what he had always hoped for: connection. But back home, recognition remained elusive. The city of Tulsa refused to acknowledge the massacre publicly. There were no plaques, no statues, no official days of mourning, no citywide curriculum, no reparations. What had happened was still being referred to, when it was referred to at all, as the riot. A disturbance, an accident, an unfortunate clash. Elijah refused to use the word. It was not a riot, he would say, it was a massacre. People nodded, but few repeated the word. In private, Elijah struggled. He began waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing. Not from fear, but from a growing sense that time was running out. He had dedicated his life to remembering. But what if memory was not enough? What if, when he was gone, no one would carry the flame? He started sorting through his papers, cataloging every document, labeling every photograph, creating an index for his archives. He wanted to leave no room for confusion, no excuse for erasure. At church, he began mentoring younger members, teaching them how to record oral histories, how to verify facts, how to hold truth even when no one believed them. He said, "The world will tell you to move on, but you must decide what is worth standing still for." In 1957, on the anniversary of the massacre, Elijah organized a candlelight vigil. Only 23 people attended. They stood on a grassy patch where Mount Zion Baptist Church had once stood before being bombed to ash. Elijah read from the first chapter of his book. He read slowly, clearly, without emotion. When he finished, there was no applause, only quiet. Someone began to hum a hymn. Others joined. Their voices rose together, not loud, but full. That night, Elijah walked home alone. He did not cry, but he prayed, not to be remembered, but for the truth to survive. Later that year, a local councilman proposed a new development project that would once again cut through what remained of historic Greenwood. Elijah attended the town meeting.
He waited in the back, then stood. His voice was tired, but steady. "This is not empty land," he said. "This is a graveyard, a library, a battlefield. Every foot you pave is a name you erase." The council did not respond. The project moved forward. As bulldozers arrived, Elijah sat across the street, watching. He did not shout. He did not protest. He simply wrote. And with every sentence, he refused to disappear. In the summer of 1960, Elijah Thomas turned 75 years old. He did not celebrate. There was no party, no cake, no balloons. Just a quiet morning on his front porch, a cup of lukewarm coffee, and a silence so deep it rang like a bell. His house was small, tucked between two empty lots where homes used to stand. The paint peeled from the edges of the windows. The wooden fence leaned as if tired from decades of standing guard. Weeds crept through the sidewalk cracks, reaching for light like forgotten names. He lived alone now.
His mother had passed in her sleep years earlier, her last breath taken under the same roof she had rebuilt with her own hands. His sister had moved away to California. She sent letters once a month, polite, loving, but they never spoke of Greenwood. No one did anymore, even in Greenwood. The neighborhood still existed, but not as it had. The names had changed, the memories had faded, the buildings that rose no longer resembled what once stood. Strip malls, parking lots, a fast food restaurant where Elijah's elementary school had once been. He had grown used to being invisible. Children passed him on bicycles without looking. Clerks at the grocery store spoke to him as if through fog. Sometimes he would stand in front of a brick wall and whisper the names of people who once lived there. He did not expect answers. He only wanted the wall to remember. His health had begun to fail. He walked slower. His knees ached with every step. He could no longer climb the stairs without stopping to catch his breath. But every morning, he still sat at his desk. He still wrote. He still remembered. His second book, The Silence That Followed, had never been published. No one had agreed to print it. They said it was too long, too political, too specific. So he had printed 5 copies himself, with money he had saved from tutoring and odd jobs. 1 copy he kept, the other 4 he mailed, to universities, to black-owned newspapers, to churches. He never heard back, but that did not matter, because the pages existed. One night, Elijah found himself unable to sleep. He stepped outside, barefoot, and walked to the end of the block. There, at the edge of what had once been Greenwood Avenue, he sat on a bench. It had been placed there as part of a city beautification project. A plaque nearby read, "Tulsa's Historic North Side." It said nothing about the fire, nothing about the dead, nothing about the truth. Elijah stared at it for a long time. Then he took out a pen and wrote on the back of a crumpled envelope, "This is not history. This is a wound they painted over." He folded it carefully and tucked it into the plaque's base. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was his. The next morning, a young woman knocked on his door. She was tall, maybe 20, with dark braids and eyes too serious for her age. She introduced herself as Camille. "I am doing a school project on the Tulsa Race Massacre," she said. Elijah blinked. He had not heard those words spoken out loud in years. She continued, "I found your book at the church library, The Ashes That Speak." Elijah stared at her. He stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. They talked for hours. Camille listened. She took notes. She asked questions no one else had thought to ask. At one point, she said, "I thought I was the only one who cared." Elijah smiled. "You are not," he said, "but you may be one of the only ones brave enough to say it." She returned every Saturday for the rest of the summer. They went through his archives together. They organized documents, cataloged photographs, labeled maps. He taught her how to listen. She taught him how to hope again. Before leaving for college, she gave him a promise. "I will keep telling the story." Elijah nodded. "Do not just tell it," he said, "guard it." Time moved slower after that. Autumn came, then winter. Elijah stayed indoors more often. His legs weakened. His memory grew clouded. Some mornings he forgot the year, but he never forgot the fire, never forgot the sound of glass breaking, the scent of burning wood, the faces of friends who vanished into smoke. In January of 1961, he began writing letters.
not to friends, not to family, but to the future. He addressed them to the ones who have not forgotten. Each letter began the same way: I am still here, and so is the truth. He hid them inside books, under floorboards, behind picture frames. He knew not all would be found, but some would, and that was enough. One evening, as he sat by the window, Elijah saw a group of children playing in the street. They laughed, shouted, chased a ball down the pavement. One of them looked up and waved. Elijah waved back. It was a small moment, but it made him weep, because life had returned, because the laughter sounded like the kind he used to know, because maybe, just maybe, something had survived. He spent his final months writing the last pages of a third book. It was called The Fire Never Left. It was not a history, it was a letter to America, to its conscience, to its memory. The final sentence read, "We are not asking for vengeance, we are asking to be seen." Elijah Thomas passed away in his sleep on a cool morning in April. He was buried beside his mother, beneath an old oak tree that had survived the fire. His headstone was simple: name, date, no titles. But Camille returned the next day with a marker. She wrote 3 words into the stone: he remembered everything. In the spring of 1972, Camille Richardson stood in front of a crowded classroom at the University of Kansas, her hands trembling as she adjusted her notes. She was 29 years old, a graduate student in American Studies, and the only black woman in her cohort. Her lecture was titled, "Greenwood, the American Fire We Forgot." Behind her were slides, grainy photographs of brick ruins, black and white portraits of smiling families, and a map scorched at the edges. In the front row sat 3 professors, arms folded, faces unreadable. Camille took a breath. Then she spoke. She told them about the bombs, about the gunfire, about the people forced into camps, about how no insurance claims were paid, about how no one was punished. She told them about Elijah Thomas, and when she finished, the room was silent, not out of reverence, but out of discomfort. The first professor to speak asked, "Where is your primary source for the aircraft claim?" Camille held up Elijah's journal. "Here," she said, "and I have 4 other survivor testimonies that match." The second professor cleared his throat, "But that is not peer-reviewed." Camille straightened her back. "No," she said, "it is lived." They did not applaud. They did not ask for more. When she left the room, one of her classmates whispered, "That was brave." Another said, "Why dig up the past? Things are better now." Camille did not respond. She was used to it. She had been used to it since the day Elijah placed his hands on her shoulders and said, "You are the keeper now." After his death, Camille had inherited everything: the manuscripts, the journals, the photographs, the trunk lined with fireproof cloth. She brought it all with her to graduate school. She scanned the pages by hand. She cross-referenced his claims. She followed his maps. And the deeper she dug, the more resistance she encountered. Archivists told her certain police records had been misplaced. City officials said the bombing reports were rumors. Historians warned her not to sensationalize. One scholar even suggested that focusing on these tragedies may undermine progress. Camille almost laughed. Instead, she published. Her first paper, titled The Tulsa Disappearance, was printed in a small academic journal in 1974. It received no awards, no invitations followed, but it reached people. She began getting letters from strangers. "My grandmother lived there. She never spoke of it. My uncle had scars. Now I know why. My teacher said it was a myth. Thank you for proving them wrong." Camille saved every letter. She began giving talks at churches, community centers, and black colleges. She traveled across states with a cardboard box filled with Elijah's writings. At each event, she unfolded the same burned map of Greenwood and said, "This is what they tried to erase." Some audiences cried, others left the room. She kept going. In 1980, she submitted a formal request to the city of Tulsa to erect a historical marker at the site of the Mount Zion Baptist Church. The application was denied. The reason given? Insufficient verification of historical significance. Camille read the letter 3 times. Then she laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what Elijah had warned her about. "They will not say you are wrong," he had said. "They will say you cannot prove it." So she started proving it. She compiled survivor interviews, she dug up property records.
She found aerial photographs showing smoke rising from Greenwood. She located descendants of families who had never received $1 in compensation. And still, the silence continued. One day, Camille visited the Greenwood district with a small film crew. She stood on the sidewalk where Elijah's childhood home had once been. In front of the camera, she held up a photograph of the house: white porch, flower pots, lace curtains. Then she turned, showing what stood there now: a parking garage. "Progress," she said, "built on bones." The footage aired on local television for 2 minutes before being pulled from future broadcasts. Camille was not surprised, but she was tired. Tired of the polite refusals, tired of the gaslighting, tired of being told that what she knew had happened had not. She considered stopping, but then she found a letter. It was wedged inside the back cover of Elijah's third manuscript. It read, "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are still fighting. That means we are still alive. Even in ashes, we speak." She cried. Then she got back to work. In 1982, Camille co-founded the Greenwood Historical Recovery Project. Their mission: to gather, verify, and preserve every available piece of truth related to the 1921 massacre. They started with 5 volunteers. Within a year, they had recorded 73 oral histories, collected more than 200 photographs, and located the burial site of a previously undocumented victim. They printed a small book titled "We Were There." It sold 3,000 copies in its first year. By 1985, Camille was speaking at national conferences. She addressed crowds of hundreds. She stood before governors, university presidents, and civil rights leaders. She held up Elijah's original journal and said, "This is not just history. This is testimony. This is the America they forgot to tell you about." And people began to listen. Slowly, carefully, but they listened. When Camille turned 42, she received a letter from a publishing house. They wanted to reprint "The Ashes That Speak" as part of a new series on forgotten American voices. She agreed on one condition: Elijah's name would be the only name on the cover. The new edition sold well. It was taught in classrooms, cited in textbooks, recognized by historians who had once doubted it. Camille kept none of the credit. When asked why, she said, "Because I am not the author. I am the echo." Still, she was not finished. Not until the city of Tulsa said the words Elijah had waited a lifetime to hear. Not until the truth was carved into stone. Not until every name lost to the flames was written down and spoken aloud. Because Camille understood what Elijah had always known. The fire never ended. It just changed form. And the only way to put it out was to tell the truth, again and again. In the spring of 1990, Camille Richardson stood before a congressional subcommittee in Washington, D.C. She wore a dark blue suit. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun. In her hand, she held a folder, plain, creased at the corners, filled with photocopies of death records, insurance claims, and testimonies handwritten in fading ink. Across from her sat 5 lawmakers, each flanked by aides. Behind her, cameras rolled, journalists scribbled. A handful of spectators filled the gallery. The hearing had been scheduled for 45 minutes. Camille spoke for 70. She began with names. One by one, she read them aloud. Not the names of politicians, not the names of generals, but the names of children who died in the fire, of mothers shot in the back, of fathers buried without ceremony. She read the name of Elijah Thomas last. Then she opened his journal and read from his final entry. "We are not asking for vengeance. We are asking to be seen." When she finished, the room was silent, a silence familiar, one filled with discomfort, not reflection. The chairman cleared his throat. "Miss Richardson, what is your desired outcome from this session?" Camille looked directly at him. Recognition, acknowledgement, a public record of the truth, federal investigation into government complicity, and the beginning of a path toward repair. Another lawmaker asked, "Are you implying the federal government was involved in the events of 1921? Camille replied without hesitation, "I am stating it directly. Federal agents stood by. State forces enabled the violence. Planes were launched from city grounds. This was not a riot. It was state-supported racial terrorism. The hearing ended abruptly. Reporters swarmed her outside the chamber. Some praised her bravery. Others called her radical. One man shouted, "Why stir this up now?" She turned and answered him, "Because it never settled." That night, Camille returned to her hotel room and collapsed onto the bed. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of history. She had known it would be hard. She had not expected it to feel this lonely. In the weeks that followed, her name appeared in editorials across the country. Some described her as a truth-teller. Others called her divisive. One newspaper wrote, "Richardson's Greenwood crusade risks reopening wounds long healed." Camille clipped that sentence and taped it above her desk. She wrote beneath it in pen, "Wounds do not heal when covered in lies." Despite the backlash, momentum grew. Camille began appearing on talk shows, documentaries, and news specials. She sat across from hosts who smiled too politely, nodded too quickly, and ended every segment with phrases like "food for thought." She spoke at universities where students lined up to ask questions. Why were we never taught this? Why did no one stop it? What do we do now? She answered carefully, because truth required precision, because the wrong word could be used against her. Still, resistance followed her everywhere. She received anonymous letters. One read, "Let the past die." Another said, "You are turning people against America." She read them once and filed them away. Because threats were not new. Because Elijah had faced the same silence in different clothes. And because her work was not about vengeance. It was about truth. In 1992, Camille helped draft the Greenwood Public Truth Act, a proposal for federal acknowledgement, funding for survivor descendants, and the creation of a national archive. She testified again, this time with more support: historians, lawyers, survivor families. But the act stalled in committee. Too controversial, they said. Too expensive. Too late. Camille sat outside the Capitol steps that evening, staring at the dome lit against the night sky. An aide sat beside her. "You came close," he said. Camille shook her head. Close is how stories die. The next year, she shifted strategy. She launched a campaign across schools, partnering with educators to bring Greenwood into history curriculums. Within 5 years, 43 school districts had adopted materials she helped write. She watched as students, black, white, brown, read aloud from Elijah's journals. She watched them pause, blink, look up, not with guilt, but with understanding. It gave her strength. In 1997, a national television network released a primetime documentary titled Tulsa 1921, The Night America Forgot. Camille served as chief historical advisor. The program aired to over 10 million viewers. The next morning, her phone rang nonstop. Survivors' grandchildren called to say thank you. Teachers called to ask for more resources. One woman called from Georgia and said, "I sat with my father and we cried." Camille hung up the phone and wept for the first time in years, not out of sorrow, but out of knowing she had been heard. And yet, not everyone welcomed the truth. Protests formed at some school board meetings. Commentators accused her of anti-American narratives. A senator called for defunding programs that promoted racial resentment. Camille responded with one sentence: "There is no resentment in truth, only in denial." In 1999, the city of Tulsa announced the formation of the Greenwood Commission, a group charged with officially investigating the massacre and issuing findings. Camille was asked to chair it. She accepted. The commission worked for 2 years. They examined documents long buried in basements. They interviewed survivors in their 90s. They mapped the destruction using aerial imagery and eyewitness maps, many traced from Elijah's original sketches. And finally, in 2001, the Greenwood Commission released its report. It concluded that the 1921 massacre was premeditated racial violence, that government entities failed to protect citizens, that survivors and their families were owed compensation, that the word riot was a mischaracterization. Camille stood on stage at the press conference. She read the findings aloud, and then she said, It took 80 years for the truth to be spoken here. Let us pray it takes less time for justice to follow." The room erupted in applause, but Camille did not smile.
Because she knew truth without action was just another form of forgetting. In the spring of 2002, Camille Richardson stood once again before the United States Congress. This time, she was not alone. Beside her stood descendants of survivors, constitutional lawyers, economists, and civil rights advocates. Behind her were rows of chairs filled with elders who had lived through the massacre. Those still able to walk, those pushed in wheelchairs, those who had waited their entire lives for this moment. The hearing room was full. On the table in front of Camille lay a new document, the Greenwood Compensation Proposal. The report was over 400 pages long. It outlined the destruction of property, the long-term generational trauma, the wealth gap caused by the massacre, and the legal framework for reparations. Camille had spent 2 years preparing it. She had hired experts. She had checked every number 3 times. There were no loopholes. There was no doubt. She opened her speech not with emotion, but with data. She explained how over 1,000 homes had been destroyed, how more than 4,000 people had been displaced, how an entire black economic system had been eradicated in less than 48 hours. She broke it down into modern financial equivalents, over $100 million in lost property and economic growth. At minimum, she concluded with a sentence she had rehearsed for weeks. If the government could sanction the destruction, it can fund the repair. Then she sat down. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the questions came. The first senator said, "Ms. Richardson, are you suggesting that taxpayers today should pay for something that happened before they were born?" Camille replied calmly, "I am suggesting that a nation should pay for what it chose to forget and what it allowed to happen. Time does not erase responsibility." Another congressman asked, "Is this not opening the door to endless claims of historical injustice?" Camille nodded. It opens the door to acknowledgement, to truth, and to precedent. That is what justice systems are built for. A third voice, more aggressive, accused her of trying to rewrite history. Camille did not flinch. "I am trying to stop you from erasing it." The hearing grew tense. Some lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at Camille like she was a threat, not to security, but to a carefully curated national narrative. Behind the microphones, journalists scribbled furiously. The word reparations had become dangerous, volatile, divisive. Camille knew it would be. But she also knew that the word riot had been used for 80 years to protect those who killed, while reparations now threatened only those who refused to remember. After the hearing, Camille was escorted out a back entrance to avoid protesters. Some held signs that read, "Stop weaponizing history." Others shouted phrases like, "This is America, not Africa." She walked silently to her car. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. That night, she received 24 emails. Some were threats, others were pleas. One woman wrote, "Please do not give up. My grandfather never spoke about Greenwood. I think he was waiting for someone like you." Camille printed the message and taped it beside her desk. She returned to work the next morning. Over the next 6 months, she held town halls across the country. She explained the proposal. She took questions. She faced hecklers, cynics, and skeptics. She never raised her voice, because her weapon was not volume, it was evidence. In Detroit, a man in the crowd asked, "What would reparations even look like?" Camille answered plainly, "Restoration of wealth, access to land, investment in education, public acknowledgement, and, most importantly, the telling of the truth in every school, every book, every corner of this country." In Los Angeles, someone asked, "Why now?" She replied, "Because waiting has only helped the lie grow stronger." In Atlanta, a teenager stood up and asked, "Do you think they will ever say sorry?" Camille looked at her. "They may, but a true apology comes with action." Back in Washington, the bill stalled. Lawmakers delayed the vote. Amendments were proposed to water it down. Some suggested changing the word compensation to reconciliation. Others wanted to remove the term government accountability. Camille refused. "This is not a gesture," she said. "It is a correction." In the media, the conversation exploded. Cable news debated the issue nightly. Some hosts accused Camille of trying to profit from victimhood. Others called her the conscience of a sleeping America.
Camille watched the debates from home. She made notes on every lie. She circled every phrase that attempted to soften the truth. One host said, "We should focus on unity, not division." Camille whispered at the screen, "You cannot unify what you will not name." Outside the media bubble, something remarkable began to happen. People began organizing. Churches held Greenwood Remembrance Nights. Teachers requested lesson plans. Philanthropists offered to fund memorials and scholarships. College students started reading Elijah's journals aloud on campus lawns. One night, Camille received a video from a class in South Carolina. 20 high school students stood in front of a chalkboard. Each one read one name from the Greenwood dead. Then they said in unison, "We remember." Camille cried, the kind of cry that shakes the chest and makes the air feel holy, because for the first time, she did not feel alone. In early 2003, the proposal was scheduled for a formal floor debate in the House of Representatives. It was a historic moment. C-SPAN carried it live. Camille sat in the gallery, holding Elijah's original journal in her hands. She watched as lawmakers stood to speak. Some spoke in support. They read from the commission's report. They quoted survivors. One representative held up a photograph of Greenwood before the fire and said, "This was not just a neighborhood."
And we burned it. Others pushed back. One lawmaker said, "We cannot legislate guilt." Another said, "Slavery ended a long time ago." Camille closed her eyes and whispered, "This was not slavery. This was 1921. This was my city. This was my people." The debate lasted hours. In the end, the proposal failed by 7 votes. Camille sat still. She did not speak to reporters. She did not return phone calls. She walked alone to her hotel and sat by the window, watching the lights of Washington flicker against the night sky. In her lap, the journal remained open. On the first page, Elijah had written, "History cannot breathe if we keep its mouth closed." Camille placed her hand on the words. She whispered, "I opened it. I swear I did." And somewhere deep in the bones of the country, she hoped the truth had begun to stir. By 2005, Camille Richardson had grown tired of chasing policy. She had spent more than a decade navigating the corridors of Congress, facing down opposition in courtrooms, and speaking into microphones that sometimes distorted her voice and often silenced her meaning. She was still committed, still furious, still faithful to Elijah's memory. But she also understood something deeper now. You could not legislate grief. You could not pass a bill that would rebuild trust, restore generations, or bring back the smell of bread from a bakery that no longer stood. What you could do, what she had to do, was create space for truth to live. That same year, Camille announced the Greenwood Memorial Initiative. Its goal was simple: to build the first national memorial and museum dedicated solely to the victims and survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. Not a plaque, not a line in a textbook, a place, a permanent, undeniable place. She began with community meetings. She sat with pastors, shop owners, teachers, teenagers. She asked them, "What would you want your grandchildren to see when they stand in front of this?" Some said names, some said flames. One man said, "Silence so heavy it makes you stop breathing." Camille wrote that down. She gathered artists, architects, historians. She showed them Elijah's maps. She read them his descriptions. She placed his words at the center of every design conversation. "This must not look like something from the outside," she told them. "It must look like memory feels." They worked for a year. They argued. They cried. And when the final design was ready, Camille stood before the community and said, "This will not heal what was done, but it will make it impossible to pretend it never happened." The memorial was planned for the heart of what remained of Greenwood. It would rise from the earth in soft curves, lined with scorched bricks recovered from the ruins. The entrance would feature a long wall etched with the names of the dead, not alphabetical, but in the order they were discovered. Inside, visitors would walk through rooms of testimony, of photographs, of audio recordings that could not be denied or ignored. And in the center, beneath the glass dome, would sit Elijah's original journal, open to the page that read, "We are not asking for vengeance. We are asking to be seen." Camille called it the breathing archive. Construction began in 2007. It was funded by donations from survivors' families, from civil rights organizations, from anonymous contributors who sent envelopes filled with crumpled bills and handwritten notes. One letter read, "I am sorry it took me this long." Camille saved everyone. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on a cool April morning. Over 500 people gathered on the edge of the empty lot. Elders sat wrapped in blankets, children held candles, a local choir sang softly, and Camille stood before the microphone, her voice steady. "This is not a grave," she said. "This is a beginning." As construction moved forward, Camille traveled the country collecting artifacts. She found a burnt hymn book in a church basement in Missouri. She discovered a grocery ledger from a store destroyed in the fire. She interviewed the great-granddaughter of a survivor who had kept her father's wedding ring hidden inside a Bible. Each item was cataloged, preserved, and prepared for display, not as relics, but as reminders. The Breathing Archive opened its doors in June 2010. Lines stretched around the block. Reporters from national outlets attended. The mayor of Tulsa spoke at the dedication, and for the first time in the city's official history, he used the word massacre. Camille stood in the front row, her hands clasped tightly. When the doors opened, she was the last to enter. She walked slowly through each exhibit. She paused at the wall of names. She stopped in front of the audio station where Elijah's voice played, recorded decades ago on a dusty cassette tape. "I remember the flames," he said. "I remember how they lit the night like false stars." Camille placed her hand over the speaker. Then she stepped into the central chamber. There, beneath the dome, in a case lined with velvet, sat the journal. The pages were open. The ink had faded, but the words remained. Visitors whispered as they passed. Some cried. Others stood silently. A child reached out and touched the glass. Camille closed her eyes, not to pray, but to feel. For the first time in her life, she felt Greenwood breathing again. In the years that followed, over 1 million people visited the memorial. Students came on field trips, veterans came in uniform, celebrities came quietly, without press. Some stayed for hours, some left after 5 minutes, overwhelmed. All of them left changed. Camille watched them come and go. She greeted guests, she gave tours. She answered questions with patience and precision, but mostly she listened. To their silence, to their awe, to their shame, and to their gratitude.
One woman whispered, "I thought I knew American history, but I did not know this." Camille replied, "Now you do. That is the beginning." In 2014, the Smithsonian invited her to speak at a national symposium on historical memory. She stood in front of 1,000 scholars and said, "We cannot heal what we will not touch, and Greenwood has been bleeding under our feet for almost a century." That same year, Camille published her own book, not about policy, not about law, but about memory. It was titled The Weight of Fire. It combined Elijah's journals, her own reflections, and stories collected from hundreds of descendants. It became a bestseller, but Camille refused to do a book tour. "This is not a product," she said, "it is a reckoning." By 2016, the memorial had expanded. A new wing was added. It featured a digital archive, a research center, and a genealogy lab helping families trace their roots back to Greenwood. One teenager found his great-grandfather's name on a list of those wrongly imprisoned after the fire. He wrote Camille a letter, "You gave me back my history." Camille framed it because she knew that was all she had ever wanted. Not vengeance, not statues, not applause, just history, returned, unhidden, and held with care. By 2018, Camille Richardson had begun to slow down. She was 75 years old. The joints in her fingers no longer held pens without pain. Her knees complained every morning. Her back stiffened during long meetings. But her mind remained sharp, her voice calm, her memory precise. The Breathing Archive continued to grow. It had become not only a destination, but a pilgrimage. Families flew in from every coast. Teachers brought entire classrooms. Survivors' descendants left offerings, handwritten letters, faded photographs, small artifacts wrapped in cloth. Camille watched from the corner office high above the museum floor as history unfolded below her every day. But lately, she had been thinking about time. Not just the past, but the future. One afternoon, as she sat in her office surrounded by binders and old recordings, she heard laughter echoing through the lobby. It was youthful, alive. She stepped outside her door and saw a group of college interns gathered around the central dome. They were pointing at the journal, Elijah's journal, and whispering, arguing softly about the phrasing in his final entry. Camille smiled. Later that day, one of them came to her office. Her name was Zora. She was 22, with wide eyes and a soft voice that carried surprising conviction. "I read everything," she said, "the books, the articles, the commission report. But none of it hit me like hearing Elijah's voice." Camille gestured for her to sit. Zora did not sit. Instead, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a notebook, filled with notes, diagrams, connections between Greenwood and other historical injustices across the country. "I want to do my thesis," Zora said.
Not just Greenwood, but how entire nations decide what to forget. Camille felt something shift inside her, a quiet click, a door opening. That evening, she wrote in her personal journal, something she had not done in years. "She is not me, but she carries the same ache. That is enough." In the months that followed, Camille began meeting with Zora weekly. They discussed archival methods, narrative ethics, the difference between telling the truth and making people listen to it. Zora listened with care. She did not interrupt. She asked the right questions. And one afternoon, she asked the hardest one. "What happens when you are gone?" Camille looked at her for a long time. "I do not know," she said, "but I know what I fear." Zora waited. "I fear they will put it all behind glass and call it finished, that they will visit it like a museum instead of hearing it like a warning." Zora nodded slowly. "Then maybe we need to teach people how to carry memory, not just visit it." The next day, Camille created a new position at the archive, Director of Memory Stewardship. She gave it to Zora. Some questioned the choice. "She is too young," one board member said. Camille replied, "So was I when I began." Zora accepted the role with humility and fire. She began hosting workshops for students, training them in oral history collection. She launched a podcast featuring descendants sharing stories never recorded before. She redesigned part of the exhibit to include interactive elements that challenged visitors not only to learn, but to act. Camille watched it all unfold like a garden she had planted long ago, now blooming in ways she had never imagined. Still, she remained involved. She edited essays, she advised new researchers, she sat with survivors in their final days. But she also began preparing. She called her lawyer and revised her will. She donated her entire personal archive, letters, recordings, handwritten notes, to the Breathing Archive. She wrote a letter to be read aloud at her memorial. She even recorded a short video, seated in her favorite chair by the window. In the video, she said, "If you are watching this, then I am no longer here, but do not lower your voices, raise them. Do not close the books, write more. Do not build monuments, build movement. And if anyone asks why you care about something that happened long ago, look them in the eye and say, because someone cared enough to tell me." She stored the recording in the vault, labeled it Final Instructions, and felt no fear, because she had already lived beyond fear. One afternoon in early spring, she invited Zora to her house. They sat in the garden. Camille poured tea. Zora asked, "Do you think it was worth it? All of it?" "Yes, the fight, the years, the pain." Camille smiled.
Elijah did not live to see a single plaque with his name on it, but his voice is inside every room of that building. That is more than worth it. Zora hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever wonder what he would say now?" Camille closed her eyes for a moment. He would say, "It is your turn now." And then he would probably tell me to get some rest. They both laughed. It was not a heavy laugh. It was soft, grateful. Later that evening, Camille walked Zora to the door. Before she left, Zora turned and asked, "When did you know it was time to pass it on?" Camille thought for a moment. "When you stopped asking me for permission to speak." Zora smiled, and Camille knew. It had happened. The fire had been passed, not extinguished, transformed. And Greenwood, once buried beneath ash and denial, now breathed through the lungs of a new generation. In the summer of 2020, the world stopped. A pandemic swept through countries like wildfire. Protests erupted in every major city across the United States after the killing of George Floyd. Words like justice, reform, and truth dominated headlines. And in the midst of it all, Zora Freeman stood in the center of the breathing archive, staring at Elijah's journal under glass. She had just received a call from a national television network. They wanted her to participate in a special episode titled "The Forgotten Fires of America." Tulsa would be the opening story. Zora agreed on one condition: no narration. Let the survivor speak. The producers hesitated. She did not. And they listened. 2 weeks later, Zora appeared on screen in millions of households. She wore a simple black blouse, no makeup, no filter. She looked directly into the camera and said, "My name is Zora Freeman. I am not a historian. I am a witness. Not to the fire itself, but to the silence that followed." She paused. Then she said, "This is the truth. You may not like it, but it belongs to you too." Within hours, the video went viral. Clips spread across TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Greenwood 1921, Truth in Ashes, America Forgot. For the first time, teenagers in Florida, Kansas, and Alaska typed the word Tulsa into search bars, not to find hotels, but to find history. Zora saw the shift begin in real time. The Breathing Archive's website crashed from traffic. Teachers requested digital lesson plans. High schools invited her to speak remotely. So she did. She spoke not like a professor, but like a storyteller. She said, "You were not taught this because someone thought you could not handle it, but I believe you can." She launched a video series on YouTube, What They Never Taught Us. The first episode was titled, "This Was Not a Riot." It reached 2 million views in 1 week. The comments poured in. "I had no idea. I am angry. I want to learn more." Zora responded to as many as she could. She wrote, "It is never too late to remember, but it is dangerous to keep forgetting." She began building a digital Greenwood map, an interactive reconstruction. Users could click on homes, see photographs, read testimonies, hear audio recordings. It was immersive, devastating, real. Within months, universities partnered with her. Grants came in. Journalists covered it. The Smithsonian requested to archive the project. Zora declined. She wanted it open, accessible, free, not behind walls, because Elijah had written on the last page of his journal, "The truth should never cost more than the lie did." She painted that quote above the digital lab's entrance. One afternoon, a 15-year-old girl emailed her, "My great-grandmother never told us she lived in Greenwood. I showed her your map. She cried for the first time in decades. She said, 'I thought no one remembered. Now I do. Now we do.'" Zora printed the message and taped it to her wall. Camille saw all of it unfold from a quiet corner. By now, her body moved slower. Her hair had turned snow white. She visited the archive less often, but every time she did, she smiled. One day, she watched Zora host a live stream from the Central Hall. Over 40,000 people tuned in. Zora spoke calmly, powerfully, and at the end, she asked viewers to do one thing: call your school board. Ask if Greenwood is in the curriculum. If it is not, ask why. The next day, hundreds of school boards across the country received emails, phone calls, and petitions. Some responded with resistance, others with curiosity, a few with change. Zora did not expect miracles, but she knew one thing clearly now. The fire was spreading again. This time, not in destruction, but in light.
In 2021, on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, Zora stood at the center of the breathing archive for the memorial ceremony. Thousands gathered in silence. Bells rang at exactly 10:03 p.m., the time the first flames had consumed Greenwood. Zora stepped onto the stage, holding Elijah's journal. She did not read from it. Instead, she looked out at the crowd and said, "Elijah remembered everything. Camille remembered to speak. And now, I remember to share. Let this not be a moment. Let this be a movement." That night, the archive stayed open past midnight. People lit candles, placed flowers, sang old hymns. For the first time, the President of the United States issued a national address acknowledging the massacre. It was brief, carefully worded, but it happened. Zora watched it on a screen from inside the museum. Camille sat beside her. She reached out, squeezed her hand, and whispered, "He would be proud." Zora nodded, "But I still want more." Camille smiled, "You should." The next morning, Zora submitted a proposal for a national digital database of suppressed American events.
She called it the Unspoken Archive. It would include not only Greenwood, but other towns, communities, and families erased from official textbooks. Within a year, the project received federal support, and Zora became its director. She recruited a team of researchers, coders, artists. She said, "We are not historians, we are torchbearers." Together, they digitized thousands of documents. They interviewed families. They built a platform where users could upload family stories, connect timelines, and restore forgotten truths. One feature allowed users to light a virtual candle for each name lost in Greenwood. Over 200,000 flames burned by the end of that year. Zora visited Camille more often now. They no longer talked about strategy. They talked about memory, about legacy, about the weight of carrying names. On Camille's final birthday, Zora brought her a small framed quote. It read, "They tried to erase us. We digitized ourselves." Camille laughed softly. "Not bad for an old woman with a shoebox full of cassette tapes." Zora kissed her forehead. "No, not bad at all." That night, Zora walked home through the quiet streets of Greenwood. 100 years ago, those same streets had burned. Now they whispered. Now they breathed. And in the darkness, lit only by the glow of memory, Zora knew. It was just the beginning. By the spring of 2023, Greenwood had become a name people recognized, not just in Oklahoma, but across the United States. It appeared in textbooks, in documentaries, in college lectures, in conversations over dinner tables. Thanks to Zora's work, the story was no longer silent. But with recognition came risk. That year, a major media company approached Zora with a proposal. They wanted to produce a feature-length film based on Greenwood. Their vision, a big-budget historical epic full of drama, romance, tragedy. They promised wide distribution, major actors, international awards. They offered Zora an executive producer title and a generous fee. She read the script, and she felt the temperature in her chest drop. It opened with fictional characters. It conflated timelines. It reduced Elijah to a single line, an old preacher who tried to warn them. It removed Camille entirely. And it ended with a patriotic monologue from a white journalist who exposed the truth. Zora closed the document. She stared at the company representative across the table and asked, "Why?" He shrugged. "We want people to watch it, not just the ones who already care." Zora smiled. Then she stood. "I do not need 1,000,000 people to care about a lie. I need a few thousand to carry the truth." She walked away from the deal. That week, headlines surfaced. Greenwood's story option dropped amid creative differences. Social media buzzed. Some praised her. Others accused her of being too precious with history. One commentator tweeted, "Why not dramatize? It is just a story." Zora replied, "It is not just a story. It is a graveyard." Meanwhile, something more subtle began to unfold. Tourism increased in Tulsa. Businesses opened near the breathing archive, cafes, gift shops, themed hotels. One coffee shop sold Greenwood roast. Another sold t-shirts with slogans like "Burn bright like Greenwood." Zora received a box of souvenirs as a gift. She returned them with a note: "This is not branding, this is blood." But not everyone agreed. A group of local investors began planning a Greenwood Heritage Park. It would include a replica town, a themed street, guided tours with actors dressed in 1920s clothing. The city approved funding. They asked Zora to advise on historical accuracy. She declined. "This is not a place to be reenacted," she said. "It is a place to be remembered." Some accused her of being inflexible. A council member told her, "You are standing in the way of economic growth." Zora responded, "If your economy depends on softening a massacre, then you are building on broken bones." The backlash grew louder. Blogs criticized her. Pundits debated her. One editorial read, "Zora Freeman wants to freeze history instead of letting us process it." She sighed, because she had heard this before. It was the same thing said to Camille and to Elijah. She remembered Elijah's words, "They will not deny you, they will dilute you." Zora decided to act. She organized a national symposium on ethical memory. Historians, artists, teachers, survivors' descendants all came to discuss how to honor trauma without exploiting it. The event was broadcast online. Hundreds of thousands watched. In her keynote, Zora said, "We must be wary of those who praise the past while erasing its sharpest edges. Not all visibility is justice. Not all remembrance is respect." She proposed new guidelines for historical representation: authenticity, consent, context, continuity. The guidelines were adopted by several museums, but others ignored them. Later that year, a popular video game included a mission set in Greenwood 1921. It involved running across burning rooftops and dodging mobs. When Zora saw the footage, she was speechless, not with outrage, but with sorrow. They had turned horror into entertainment. She contacted the company. She demanded removal. They offered to add a historical disclaimer. She refused. After public pressure, the mission was taken down, but the damage remained. Zora began receiving messages from students who said they had first learned about Greenwood through that game. She knew then that the fight had changed. The threat was no longer silence, it was distortion, and distortion, once accepted, became its own form of forgetting. Zora doubled down. She launched a new initiative, Memory Without Monetization, a campaign to protect historical trauma from exploitation. She partnered with educators, policymakers, and survivor families. She lobbied for legislation that would regulate commercial use of mass atrocity narratives. Critics pushed back. They said she was censoring art. She answered, "I am not censoring, I am guarding."
By now, Camille's health had begun to decline. Zora visited her weekly. One day, she told her everything about the film, the video game, the fight. Camille listened in silence. Then she said, "They will always try to sell what they cannot own. Your job is not to stop them all. Your job is to make sure the truth survives longer than their appetite." Zora nodded, then asked, "But what if the truth becomes inconvenient again? What if they bury it all over?" Camille smiled weakly. "They will try, but you already planted seeds in too many places. It will grow where you cannot even see." That night, Zora walked through the archive alone. She paused before Elijah's journal. She read the words again. "We are not asking for vengeance. We are asking to be seen." Then she turned to a blank page in her notebook and wrote, "Seen is not enough. They must remember, and they must carry." In the winter of 2024, Zora Freeman boarded a flight to Berlin. It was her first time leaving the United States. In her bag, she carried scanned pages of Elijah's journal, Camille's final speech notes, and a small envelope with a pressed flower, taken from the lawn beside the breathing archive. She had been invited to speak at the Global Memory Forum, a gathering of curators, historians, and human rights scholars from around the world. The forum's theme that year was Echoes in Ash, Remembering What Nations Try to Forget. Zora's name appeared alongside survivors from Rwanda, scholars from South Africa, archivists from Bosnia, and witnesses from Cambodia. She was not nervous, she was grounded, because Greenwood was not only American history, it was human history. At the opening ceremony, each speaker was asked to light a candle and name the place they carried in their hearts. Zora stepped forward. She said, "Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, United States, 1921. A hush fell over the room because many had never heard those words in that order. But when Zora spoke, they listened. Her presentation was titled, Carrying Fire Across Oceans. She told the story, not from textbooks or policy briefs, but through Elijah's voice, Camille's choices, and her own fight to protect memory in the age of distortion. She showed images of the breathing archive. She played a clip of a survivor's voice. And then she said, memory is not geography, it is inheritance. What happened in Greenwood lives in the same space as what happened in Srebrenica, in Kigali, in Phnom Penh. Different languages, same silence. Afterward, a man from Argentina approached her. His eyes were wet. My grandfather disappeared under the dictatorship, he said. I thought no one else knew what forgetting costs. Zora replied, now you know I do, and I know you do. Over the next few days, Zora listened more than she spoke. She heard stories of governments denying massacres, of textbooks that skipped entire decades, of children taught to honor flags but not the blood beneath them, and she realized something powerful. Greenwood was not an exception. It was a pattern of erasure, of comfort prioritized over truth, of nations building pride on top of unmarked graves. She returned home changed, not more sad, more connected. The breathing archive began to evolve. Zora created a new wing called Echoes. It displayed paired exhibits, Greenwood beside Guernica, Tulsa next to Tiananmen, North Tulsa mapped beside Nanking. The point was not comparison. The point was recognition. She wrote on the welcome wall, you are not alone in your memory, and that is both a sorrow and a strength. Visitors began arriving from abroad. A delegation from South Africa left a stone at the foot of the Elijah Thomas display. A woman from Poland placed a small wooden cross next to Camille's last photograph. One day, a family from Hiroshima stood in silence for over 20 minutes in front of the wall of names. Later, the father wrote in the guest book, we carry this together now. Zora began traveling more. She spoke in Toronto, in Cape Town, in Seoul. Everywhere she went, she brought a flame from Greenwood, sometimes literal, sometimes in words. She asked the same question in every language. What are you still trying not to remember? The responses were universal, because every country has a Greenwood, every people has a silence that hurts to speak, and every truth, once whispered, echoes. In 2025, Zora helped organize the first International Day of Disremembered History. It was not a day of mourning, it was a day of storytelling. In over 30 countries, people gathered in parks, schools, libraries, and plazas. They read names, they showed photographs, they told truths that had once been dangerous. At the Breathing Archive, the event began at sunrise. Zora stood before the crowd and said, this is not about blame, it is about belonging. The truth belongs to all of us. That evening, a candlelight vigil was held. Instead of speeches, they played audio recordings from survivors across time and space. A woman from Sierra Leone, a man from Armenia, a mother from Tulsa. Their voices blended like prayer. Zora stood in the back, her eyes closed. She could feel Camille beside her. She could almost hear Elijah. And she understood. This was what they had dreamed of. Not closure, but continuation. 1 week later, Zora received an invitation from the United Nations. They wanted to feature the Breathing Archive as part of a permanent global exhibit on memory and justice. Zora agreed with one condition. The display must remain unfinished. There must always be room for the next story. They accepted. In Geneva, a room was constructed. On one wall, Greenwood. On another, Srebrenica. On another, Kigali. In the center, an empty frame.
Under it, the words, "Who have we not remembered yet?" Back in Tulsa, Zora returned to the archive with a quiet urgency. She knew what came next, not expansion, but passing on. She began mentoring new curators, young voices, new energy. She told them, "I am not your guide. I am just one step in the chain. You will walk further than me." She created a curriculum for schools abroad, translated Elijah's journal into 8 languages, and on the final page, she added a sentence. "This is Greenwood, but it could have been anywhere. Let it not be again." One evening, a student from Brazil asked her, "How do you keep going when the world keeps trying to forget?"
Zora answered, "Because I have seen what happens when they remember. I have seen how people stand taller when the silence breaks. I have seen what truth can build when it is finally allowed to breathe." That night, she wrote in her journal, "We are not just preserving history, we are repairing humanity." And she knew there was still more to do. But for the first time in a long time, she did not feel alone. Camille Richardson passed away quietly in her sleep on a Sunday morning in early autumn. She was 91 years old. The sky above Tulsa that day was the color of soft ash, the air still and heavy, as if holding its breath. News of her death spread quickly. The Breathing Archive closed its doors for 24 hours. A black ribbon was tied to the entrance gate. Flowers began appearing, left by strangers, students, elders, children. Zora received the call just after sunrise. She did not speak for a full minute after hearing the words. When she finally answered, all she said was, "I know." That afternoon, Zora walked through the archive alone. The place felt different, not empty, just changed. As if one voice had gently stepped aside, leaving behind a deep silence that echoed louder than any speech. She entered Camille's old office. The chair was still in place, the books still organized, the framed photographs, one of Elijah, one of the first memorial vigil, one of Zora as a young intern, rested on the shelf untouched. There was a sealed envelope on the desk. Zora recognized the handwriting immediately. Her own name, written in Camille's neat, slanted script. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "My fire is now yours. Remember, memory is not what we keep, it is what we give. And if you ever doubt whether it mattered, look at your own hands. You are still carrying the match." Zora pressed the paper to her chest and cried. For the first time in years, she cried not from anger or frustration or exhaustion. She cried from love, from gratitude, from knowing that some stories did not end. They continued, through those brave enough to tell them again.
The funeral was held 3 days later. It was not grand, it was not televised, it was exactly what Camille had requested: simple, honest, true. The ceremony took place inside the central dome of the Breathing Archive, the same place where Elijah's journal rested, the same place where millions had stood to learn a truth denied to generations. Zora stood at the podium. She did not read from a script. She did not recite dates or accomplishments. Instead, she looked out at the gathering and said, "Camille taught me that silence is not peace, that memory is not weakness, that truth is not optional." She did not want to be remembered. She wanted the truth to live, and because of her, it does. She stepped back, and for a moment, no one moved. Then a child, no older than 10, walked forward and placed a single white lily beside Camille's photograph. Others followed. No music played, just footsteps, just breath, just presence. Later that evening, Zora sat in Camille's old office, going through her papers. She found a small notebook labeled Final Thoughts. Inside were short reflections, unfinished ideas, memories scribbled in the margins. One entry read, "Do not let them turn Greenwood into a past tense. It still breathes." Another read, "I wonder if the next fire will be truth. I hope so." Zora copied those lines into her own journal. Then she opened her laptop. There were emails to respond to, hundreds, requests for interviews, offers to write books, invitations to speak. But she ignored them all. Instead, she opened a blank document and typed, "This is not an ending." She stared at the words, then deleted them, then typed again. "This is how we remember the ones who refuse to forget." The next day, she called a meeting with her team. She stood before them and said, "We will not expand the archive, we will deepen it. We will not modernize the voice of Greenwood, we will preserve its echoes." Camille did not spend her life building a monument. She built a memory engine. And that engine does not run on profit. It runs on pain, on care, on truth. That is what we guard. That is what we carry. The team nodded. Some wiped their eyes. No one asked for clarification. They understood. Over the following weeks, Zora began creating a new exhibit, one she had never imagined she would build. It was titled, "The Hands That Held the Fire." It was not about Elijah. It was not about Camille. It was about everyone who ever whispered the truth when no one wanted to hear it. It featured letters from teachers who lost their jobs for teaching Greenwood, audio recordings of elders speaking in their kitchens, finally ready to tell the story, photographs of children lighting candles on anniversaries they never lived through but felt in their bones. In the center of the exhibit, under a glass case, Zora placed Camille's final letter. Beside it, she included a mirror so that every visitor would see themselves in the reflection. The plaque beneath read, "You are next." Zora knew it was bold, but she also knew Camille would have smiled. A month later, Zora received an email from a school in Montana. A fifth-grade class had created a play based on Greenwood, not dramatized, not fictionalized, just voices, reading testimony, carrying names. When the performance ended, the children turned to the audience and said, "We will remember for them." Zora printed that sentence, framed it, hung it beside her desk. That night, she stood once more in front of Elijah's journal. She placed both hands on the glass and whispered, "She is gone, but the fire stayed." In the spring of 2026, the Breathing Archive reached its 20th year. 20 years since the first stone was placed, 105 years since Greenwood burned. On a soft Sunday morning, Zora Freeman walked alone through the archive before opening hours. She touched the cool walls, the displays, the glass that protected so many fragile things. In her hands was a box. Inside it were 3 items: Elijah's last letter, Camille's final notebook, and a list of every name engraved on the memorial wall, reprinted, clean, preserved. Zora made her way to the central chamber. She unlocked the base of Elijah's display case and placed the box gently inside. Then she sealed it, not as an ending, as a gesture of trust, a signal to the future, that what was held in these walls was no longer in danger of vanishing, that enough people had seen, remembered, and carried it forward. Later that morning, Zora stepped onto a small outdoor stage. It was not a press event. It was not for officials or cameras. It was for a group of high school students from across the country. 40 young people, gathered through a national fellowship. They had written essays, created projects, interviewed descendants, all to earn the right to stand on this ground. Zora looked at them. Each face was different. Each eye carried something old. She began to speak. You were not there. You did not smell the smoke. You did not hear the screams. You did not run through ash, or dig through rubble, or bury your father with your own hands. You were not in Greenwood on that night in 1921. But now you know, and now that you know, you cannot unknow. You cannot pretend this is someone else's history, because this country was not built in chapters. It was built in memory, brick by blood, truth by truth. She paused. The wind carried her voice into stillness. Greenwood was a city, but Greenwood is also a lesson. It is a warning. It is a mirror. It shows what happens when fear is louder than justice, when silence is chosen over truth, when those with power confuse order with peace. She stepped closer. Her voice softened. I do not ask you to feel guilt. I ask you to feel guardianship, because you live in a world shaped by what others chose to forget, and you have a chance now to choose what is remembered next. One of the students, a young boy from Michigan, raised his hand. He asked, "What if we are not strong enough?" Zora walked to him. She knelt and said, "Then do it anyway, because remembering does not require perfection. It requires courage, and courage is something you build together." Later that evening, after the students left, Zora sat by the reflection pool behind the archive. She watched the sun dip low. Its golden light caught the engraved names in fire. She remembered a sentence Camille once said, "Let no name rest in the dark." The pool was quiet, only the ripple of wind, the breath of memory. In that moment, Zora wrote one final entry in her personal journal. It read, "I am not Elijah. I am not Camille. I am not Greenwood. I am a witness. I am a bridge. And my job is not to hold the past. It is to hand it forward, so that when the next voice trembles with truth, they will not stand alone." A week later, the archive unveiled its newest installation, a single room,
White walls, no text, just one chair in the center, a mirror in front of it, and speakers that whispered testimonies from Greenwood, softly, endlessly. Above the door, the inscription, "This is where you decide who you are." People entered silently. Some stayed 5 minutes. Some stayed an hour. Some emerged changed. Others returned weeks later with friends. One teacher brought his entire class and said, "I want you to see what honesty looks like." In that room, there was no narrator, no screen, no guide, just reflection, just truth, just the question, what will you carry? That year, the Breathing Archive received recognition from the United Nations as a global site of conscience. But Zora said no award mattered more than a child saying, "I know now." Because that was all Elijah wanted. That was all Camille asked. And that was what Zora had fought for so long. In the final shot of the film, we return to Greenwood Avenue. Not in 1921, but now. The street is quiet. Shadows stretch across red brick. The camera moves slowly, past the plaque, past the wall of names, into the Breathing Archive, through the rooms, past the dome, and into the mirror room. It stops at the chair. The mirror reflects empty space, but we hear voices, not loud, not scripted, real. A child reading a name, a teacher explaining history, a mother whispering to her daughter, "This is who we are." Then silence. Then light. Then the final words, across the screen. History does not disappear. It waits for someone brave enough to say it aloud.